Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to break down Quique Setien's tactics in Barcelona's 2-2 draw against Celta Vigo. When we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have Barcelona in a 4-3-3, and we ended up seeing Celta Vigo playing a 3-5-2 that ultimately transitioned into a 5-3-2 without the ball. When we look at how that 5-3-2 should operate against Barcelona's 4-3-3, what you end up seeing is that you should have Smolov and Iago Aspas in between Ivan Rakitic. If they both look to press forward, then that allows Ivan Rakitic time to get on the ball unless you have Yokuşlu step forward. But what we ended up seeing from Celta Vigo is that they had one striker on Rakitic and then the other stepping into the center back on the ball and vice versa. If they didn't want to press those two center backs, then they would both stick near Rakitic. But as you could see, Rakitic eventually throughout that game was able to get on the ball, and we ended up seeing him play positive passes in between the forwards and the midfield shuttlers to get the ball out to Jordi Alba, to get the ball to Messi dropping off of Jacobo, or you would see him get the ball out to Vidal shifting towards the touchline. Nevertheless, when we continue with this system, as you can see, it does have three players in that midfield zone, but there's no real width besides the wing back. So if Barcelona get the ball to their advanced fullbacks, you need the midfield shuttlers to shift across, and then you have Yokuşlu being able to protect that spare player based off the fact that Rakitic is taken out of the game. And then out at the back, you have 3v1 against Luis Suarez. So you ideally don't want your wingbacks to step out to those fullbacks, because then that leaves Lionel Messi and Ansu Fati against your wider center backs. However, if you ended up seeing those players move in a bit narrow and you have Jordi Alba and Nelson Semedo pushing forward, then those wing backs would have to step out into that path. But when we look to Quique Setien's tactics, first we have to start with Lionel Messi, because Celta Vigo had a clear tactic as to how they were looking to close him down. So when you have Messi up front between Jacobo and George, what you end up seeing was that if the ball gets shifted out into the path of Nelson Semedo, then Suarez shifts out into that path. If Messi drops out into a wider position, Jacobo steps out into that path. And with Vidal looking to push forward, George ended up stepping out into his path to ensure that he couldn't get on the ball. However, we saw varied movement down that right-hand side, but Celta Vigo did a very good job of stifling Lionel Messi's influence throughout this game. Like I said, if Messi was in between George and Jacobo, if Messi dropped off deeper, George would stick tight on him, and that's when you would see Arturo Vidal being closed down by Yokuşlu. There were times where we ended up seeing Vidal shift out to the right-hand side, but then Suarez would step into his path. If Lionel Messi drifted out into a wider position, Jacobo would be tight on him and Suarez would move to Semedo, moving narrow. And what we would see was that Yokuşlu would still stick to Vidal, but we ended up seeing Vidal adopt more advanced positions in between Jacobo and George, or in between Araujo and George. Nevertheless, if you have Vidal higher up in that position and you have Messi taken out of the game by Jacobo, there were times where we did see Suarez cheat a bit to the right-hand side to ensure that it was 1v2 and Lionel Messi couldn't get out of that tight position on the touchline. The final position that we often saw Lionel Messi take up was just ahead of Suarez in that narrow right position. So what you ended up seeing was that he would try to receive the ball in his own half or just ahead of that halfway line, and then you would see Suarez shift into his path. That does leave a gap for Nelson Semedo on that touchline, because what we'd end up seeing is that Jacobo would shift a bit narrow to ensure that it is 1v2. As that game continued, we even saw Smolov drop off a bit deeper, and at times it was 1v3. The reason why teams have looked to stifle Messi in this manner is because with that narrow shape, as you can see, you have three players boxing him in, or even if you have two players boxing him in, if he cuts across Suarez, you have Yokuşlu and Mendes looking to clog that center of the pitch. And with the movement of his attacking players, what we ended up seeing was that you have Ansu Fati looking to make darting runs in between Aidu and Komasana, and that creates a space for Jordi Alba. And when you look to the right-hand side, you also end up seeing Messi being able to play long balls over the top to Semedo, and frankly, that did lead to Barcelona's best chances into that game. Meanwhile, down that left-hand side, Barcelona didn't really offer much of an attacking threat. You did have Ansu Fati adopting a narrow position between Comasana and Aidu, and that created a gap for Jordi Alba to push forward based off of that narrow 5-3-2 shape. What you end up seeing from that 5-3-2 is that you need Mendes to shift out into the path of Jordi Alba, and if he does that, you simply have Yokuşlu step into the path of Riqui, and then you have Luis Suarez shift over to Vidal based off the fact that they're looking to compress space on that flank. So what we ended up seeing was that Barcelona tried to get Jordi Alba higher up the pitch so that they could pull out Comasana, and then they wanted Ansu Fati to shift into that zone, but Aidu did a very good job. So Ansu Fati's movement was predominantly to create space for Jordi Alba down that left-hand side to break him behind or deliver crosses, but Celta Vigo did a very good job of limiting his threat, and if you had Ansu Fati shifting out into that zone, Comasana would simply stick in towards that gap. So the only real threat that Ansu Fati presented was if he was making runs in between Comasana and Aidu, or in between the center backs to break him behind. Celta Vigo were well equipped down that side. And then when we get to Luis Suarez, although he was the decisive Barcelona player here in and around the box, from open play he struggled to have an influence. Messi couldn't get the ball into him from that right side of the pitch. There were no crosses going into the box, and when he looked to drop off a bit deeper, there was always a spare man in Araujo or George who would drop off deeper, stick tight to him, and force him to play passes back or foul him. Meanwhile, the biggest issue that Barcelona had besides their individual mistakes was the positioning of their defense. You had Jordi Alba and Nelson Semedo pushing high, but the problem here was that you only had Rakitic protecting Umtiti and Piqué. So with Riqui, Puig, and Vidal in more advanced positions, Rakitic didn't have enough protection ahead of the back four, given the fact that the fullbacks were pushed high up the pitch and Umtiti was getting caught out of position. And then Celta Vigo were able to break and exploit space in those channels. Barcelona were warned late on in that first half when Umtiti pushed forward to try and find Luis Suarez, and you ended up seeing Yokuşlu win the ball, skip past Riqui, Puig, and then you ended up seeing a gap between Piqué and Rakitic covering for Umtiti to find Iago Aspas. And luckily for Barcelona, Piqué came across and covered off that passing lane to Smolov to ensure that Ter Stegen wasn't tested. But when you look to the build-up to Celta Vigo's equalizer, it was similar. This time Rakitic losing the ball, and then you end up seeing Yokuşlu run off him and Iago Aspas splitting Umtiti and Rakitic to again lead to a 2v1. Piqué couldn't block off the passing lane from Yokuşlu to Smolov, and that was how Celta Vigo were able to get back into the game. The other threat that Barcelona experienced in that second half was Celta Vigo pressing high to ensure that they couldn't build out of the back. They had the forward stepping to the center backs, they had the wing backs pushing to the full backs, and Yokuşlu pushed higher to step into the path of Rakitic. The only real gaps that were available was Messi in between Jacobo and George, and then Ansu Fati in between Comasana and Aidu. And those were the gaps that Barcelona tried to exploit through long balls over the top. We saw Ter Stegen clip a long ball for Messi in between George and Jacobo, and that led to a chance that Messi should have converted. And later on, with Aspas stepping into the path of Umtiti, he clipped a long ball over Aidu, but Ansu Fati couldn't get beyond him. Besides that, Barcelona found a gap down that right-hand side when Semedo was able to play balls beyond Luis Suarez to Vidal and Messi to pull out Jacobo, and then they would split those two players to get Semedo back into position. But it was Celta Vigo who were more proactive after Barcelona took the lead. They ended up bringing on Bradaric and Rafinha to help control that midfield, and they brought on Nolito, who did play a key role running at Semedo, and later on Santi Mina came on and they ended up shifting to a 4-1-4-1. They were able to equalize through a moment of brilliance from Iago Aspas, and they should have won the game later on when Umtiti was pulled out of position and no one was tracking the run of Luis Suarez that should have led to a Nolito goal. Hi everybody, thanks for watching and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.